The driving force for what would become the B1 was le père de char General Estienne. 1921 he came up with a requirement for a tank of about 13 tons with the main gun mounted low in the hull. The thinking behind this was the choice of target, fortifications. They tended to have firing slits which were low to the ground, and the thinking was if you had a low mounted gun, you would have a suitable trajectory for placing the round through the gun slit. Now, what this tells you about the level of expectation for 1920s tank accuracy is another matter, but that was the thinking. Other requirements that he had was a 120 horsepower engine, 25 millimeters of armor, and a turret with machine guns. Now, what he had in mind was a competition. He would take various submissions from manufacturers, he would pick and choose the various different characteristics of the tank to create one ideal tank, which would then be manufactured by all the various different companies to the same design. Now, I can't find out what the prize, shall we say, was for having the most best features, but there you go. Now, it turns out that submissions were received from 5 manufacturers: FCM, Schneider, Saint-Chamond, Renault, and Delaunay Belleville. Now, the latter was very quickly rejected. It was just an FT that got stretched out with the gun mounted low and forwards. By 1924, however, the first prototypes were submitted, and you're going to start seeing, if you look at the old photographs, something of a family resemblance between what they had and the Char B as was finally built. Now, what he did was he picked and chose. He took the general shape of the Renault and the Schneider. He took the steering, clutch, differential from the Schneider as well. He took the tracks and tensioning system from FCM and suspension from Saint-Chamond. He also added a little bit more armor to make it up to 4 centimeters. And the first wooden mock-up was made in 1926. Actual construction of the tank, though, didn't happen until 1936. The reason for this elongated development process was a series of disarmament talks which were going on in Geneva at the time. One of the items under consideration was a ban on vehicles over 20 tons, which the Tractor 30, as it was now called under the management of Renault, would completely blow past. The backup plan was the D2. If the Geneva disarmament talks came to a conclusion on the matter, the D2 would be built. If not, the backstop was the B1. Now, there was an additional change mandated when somebody came up with the thought that perhaps this tank ought to be capable of fighting enemy tanks, and the machine guns just were not going to cut it. The solution was to create a new turret and to mount a 47mm into it. The final vehicle, the B1, was actually only intended to be an interim vehicle, with the B2 and the B3 subsequently planned. However, with the rearmament of Germany going on at the time, it was deemed advisable to simply go with what they had ready to produce. And as a result, the only modification of any note was the B1 bis. This added extra armor to a grand total of about 6 centimeters, and this is the vehicle behind me in Saumur. And this is all a very long-winded way of saying that this is the vehicle that we're going to take a tour around, if you didn't figure it out from the title card on the video. The overall shape of the tank is almost reminiscent of a British World War I design, with the tracks going all the way over the top of the body. The body itself is riveted, and that means that you can see simply enough the thickness of the plate, the 6 centimeters, which is reasonably well sloped for the time. You can also see a prominent driver's housing, and this is actually somewhat necessary because although the tank has huge bulk, it's actually not all that big. The idlers are prominent and exposed, but that does at least mean that there's a good obstacle crossing capability because the track is so far in front of everything else, to include the gun. Just inboard, there is the armored housing for the headlight, and inboard of that is the builder's plate for Renault. Underneath the builder's plate is the vehicle's hull number, in this case 81. Finally, on the right-hand side is a 7.5 centimeter gun. It is fixed in train, and you will see that the body of the vehicle is actually pulled back underneath the gun, presumably because there is no requirement for anybody's legs to be there, although they do retain a strengthening bar going across the front. As you come around to the side of the tank, you can see the overall bulk. It's a long tank, it'll cross a 2.75 meter gap. Track tension is done as ever at the front of the tank with the idler. There is an unbolted latch. You remove back the armor plate and the bolt is visible. This is a worm gear, pretty similar to the original design on the FCM. And you simply rotate the bolt. This will then screw the idler forwards or backwards to adjust your tension. Starting at the front, just after the track tension port, there is the only mud chute which is on the vehicle. Now, and it is at the end of the return run. The vehicle return itself is simple. It is skids only. Friction and noise doubtless the result, but there's no return rollers. The links, they're sort of an old school type link, almost like from the Holt bulldozer, and there are 63 per side. There are no center guides or guide horns. The wheels are kept on by a flange on each side of the wheel. The wheels themselves are paired. Each pair is mounted on a bogie pair, and things go on from there. Down at the bottom is the access port for maintaining the bogies. As you move further back, you're going to see the rather large radiator grille. Now, the radiator grille is only mounted on the left-hand side. This is not a symmetrically designed tank. It was originally considered that perhaps this was going to be a weak point for enemy fire, but in the limited amount of after-action assessments that were done, there was no indication that this was the case. Something which you may not have noticed, and certainly I didn't until I'm physically in front of the tank, are these little marker lights. There's one at the back and one at the front of the tank. They're white at the front, red at the back, and they're very simply going to show you the size of the vehicle in the dark so you don't run into it. Finally, behind the armored housing, you're going to see the very large sprocket wheel, unarmored, 2 pairs of teeth per side. If you compare the other side of the tank, the asymmetric design is obvious, but the lack of the grille and instead the presence of a large, heavy door. And you can see how thick the metal is on the side here, so this will also perform an interesting function. If you have to get out under fire, you have a significant amount of protection. The back of the tank is quite sparse. You see the gently sloping rear, upon which you'll find the exhaust pipes. Now, the design of the exhaust pipe actually changed a fair bit over the production run of the vehicle. The vertical back holds the hooks, which would hold the towing chain. Clevises, of course, would go here. And on the earliest Char B1s, you would see a tow hook down here for a trailer. Now, the 400 litres of fuel that the tank carried would get the tank about 200 kilometers, but this was considered to be insufficient. The idea behind the trailer was that it would carry an additional 800 litres of fuel, plus maybe 50 litres of castor oil. I'll come back to that. 100 litres of other oils, a couple of spare track links, spare parts. Now, this was really something of an unmitigated disaster, and by 1936 they'd abandoned the idea. However, the idea of a trailer would continue to come and go over the following decades with different countries and about the same level of success. Go look up the rotor trailer, for example. Nothing else here, so just have a quick look up top here at the steering system. Now again, the tank is not symmetrical. Underneath me is a passageway behind the engines to the steering system and gearbox. This hatchback here can only be opened from within the tank, and unfortunately it's spring-loaded, it seems the wrong direction. You can see the handle uses a sort of a toothed cog to keep it in place. Now, underneath with the 5-speed gearbox is the Nader steering system. It's a hydraulic system, uses castor oil. Now, the reason for this unusual system is the fact that you had the fixed train gun. You had to steer the entire tank precisely to aim the gun. The hydraulic system used castor oil, not the same sort of castor oil that you would find, let's say, in a pharmacy, which was a distinction that was lost upon a lot of the crewmen. They used whatever castor oil they could find. They figured it was all the same. And the problem is that pharmaceutical castor oil loses its lubricating qualities after about 80 degrees Celsius. The end result was that a lot of these tanks broke down because of the wrong kind of oil, resulting in a reliability reputation, or unreliability reputation, perhaps better said. Now, the shame of it was that if you used the correct oil, this was a very reliable system. Not that you would know this to listen to the French government, who were very proud of this thing. They thought it was a great military secret. So what they did was to discourage other people or other countries from copying it, was they loudly proclaimed and emphasized the unreliability problems of the design. Whereas in reality, they were quite happy to keep it, and indeed a lot of the principles are still used today in the Leclerc tank. The engine deck is huge, and it's one of the few pre-war vehicles I can think of where the entire crew can get a bit of kip. A large part of the real estate, however, is taken up by the old basic jack here on the left. It's huge, and you can see how it's held in place with this little ratchet system here, very basic. On the other side of the tank, you're going to see some access ports for the engine, but it is not the only way of accessing the engine. Because you have this passageway underneath me, you can get to the engine from the inside. That's it for the outside of the tank, and as ever, we'll be back for the inside in part 2. Gonna have 25 millimeters of armor, be sealed against gas. You ever get those moments where you go completely blank in the head? It weighed in at over 70, and the 1A, I see you guys shaking your heads, so the kids are going, yeah, all right. For those of you who wonder, we've been trying to film this opening take for about 45 minutes now, and it's always, we made the horrible mistake of coming here on the school vacation.